Yat-e. Yat-e. Mark Charles Yinishya. Tsin bake denan nishle, do tohiglini bashichin. Tsin bake denan bashiche, do tohichitni bashinala. So the Navajo culture is a matrilineal culture, and we identify ourselves by our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is actually American of Dutch heritage, and so when I introduce myself, I say Tsin bake denan, which translated means the wooden shoe people. My father's mother is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin bake denan. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Tohichitni, which is the Bitterwater clan, one of the original clans of our Navajo people. Before we get started today, I would just like to recognize and honor the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Muskogee, or the Creek people. These were the people who lived in these lands before the Americans and before other nations came here and colonized this land. These were the people who were ethnically cleansed from these lands during the Trail of Tears. And so I would just like to, if everyone would just stand, and I'd like to just take a moment just to stand in honor of these people who have stewarded this land and took care of this land for centuries. And I'm grateful that we could be here today, and I want to just remember the people who were here long before the Americans arrived. Thank you. You can go ahead and be seated. Now, I have to warn you, in the next 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, I'm going to basically deconstruct 12 to 16 years of your education. I'm going to tell you things you never knew before. I'm going to show you things in documents you didn't know were there. And the information I'm going to give you is going to make you angry. It's going to make you want a refund if you paid for any of your education. It's going to bring up a lot of different emotions in you in the next 45 minutes. And I want to, some of you may even want to stand up and throw something at me, or you may even be tempted to walk out. I want to encourage you to stay here and not throw things at me. There's a hard history we have to talk about, but if we're going to get to a better place, we have to learn how to talk about this history. And so I want to begin this process by talking just a little bit about the process of lament. So lament is not something we talk a lot about in the American church. Lament is the process of weeping, of mourning, of allowing ourselves to sit in an uncomfortable place. A good friend of mine, Seung-Chan Rah, recently just published a book called A Prophetic Lament. In this book, he brings out several characteristics of lament, and one of the characteristics that he talks about is he compares lament to a funeral dirge. There's a dead body in the casket. It's not coming back to life. All you can do is weep over it. All you can do is mourn it. That's part of the way I want us to approach what we're going to be hearing tonight. You're going to be tempted to want to fix things. You're going to be tempted to want to stand up and run out and address things. And part of what I want us to realize is we just want to sit here. And I love in the scriptures, there's many, many examples of lament. And one of the most striking ones is actually from the book of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah chapter 1, it says, "One of my brothers came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, 'Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire.'" And Nehemiah's response was, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept." That's all he did. When he heard these things, he sat down and wept. Now, there are many things about the American church and about the church that you have not really been told, that haven't been a part of your history. So to start off with a foundation, I want to actually go all the way back to Scripture, back to the life and the person of Jesus, and I want to help us understand a few things that over the centuries we've actually begun to misinterpret or misunderstand about what Jesus actually said. So At the beginning of his ministry, in Matthew 4, verses 8 through 10, Jesus is being tempted by Satan. And Satan is throwing all kinds of things at Jesus to try and get him to disobey God and go the way of the world. One of the things that Satan does is he takes him up to a high point and he shows him the kingdoms of the world. And he says, if you will just bow down to me, I will give all of these kingdoms to you. And Jesus responds by saying, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. In John 6:14, Jesus has just fed the 5,000. A very powerful event. People are very excited and they come and he knows they want to make him king. And so Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. At the end of his ministry in John 18:36, Jesus is before Pilate. And Pilate is questioning Jesus, and Jesus says to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place. So all throughout his ministry, beginning with the temptation of Satan and ending with his interaction with Pilate, Jesus was crystal clear. He was not here to establish a Christian empire. He was not here to start a Christian country, a Christian empire, a Christian political entity. That was not Jesus' goal. And if it was his goal, he had 3 very good opportunities to make that happen. At any one of these points, he could have said, we are going to set up a Christian empire. And every time it was offered to him, he turned it down. This is not what I came here to do. This is not what I'm about. I did not come here to establish a Christian empire. Now, in the first century, the first 2 centuries, the people, the followers of Christ, the disciples, the early church, they clearly understood this. They knew the empire was over here, and they knew the church was over here. You became a member of the church through your baptism, your repentance, your confession, your discipleship, and your community. And when you became a member of the church, you stood in opposition to the empire. Your Lord was crucified by the empire. Most of his disciples were killed by the empire. The empire was out persecuting you. You knew that when you became a member of the church, there was a good chance you would be persecuted and possibly even killed by the empire. In the 4th century, Constantine became emperor of Rome. And while he was emperor, he became a Christian. And he decided to Christianize Rome. He created Christendom. He created a Christian empire, which, as we saw earlier, was never the intentions of the scriptures. Jesus did not come here to create a Christian empire. He came here knowing his kingdom was of somewhere else. And yet, in the 4th century, Constantine creates this Christian empire. And he fundamentally changes the understanding of what it means to be the church. Now, instead of joining the church between your baptism, your confession, your discipleship, and your community, now you're a member of the church because of your citizenship in the empire. This idea of a Christian empire is completely extra-biblical. It was never the intention of God. It was never the intention of Jesus. It was never the intention of Paul. But Constantine creates it. So in the 5th century, we have a dilemma, which is we have this Christian entity, this Christian empire that's out fighting wars. We have Christian citizens of the empire fighting the wars of the empire. Now, a plain text reading of Scripture doesn't allow that. So we need someone like St. Augustine to come in and do a little bit of theological gymnastics for us. He develops what is called the just war theory. The just war theory explains why a Christian empire can be doing the things of the world, such as killing people and expanding its boundaries and all the other stuff. And they justify it, they create a rule for it by creating a just war theory. Over the centuries, the just war theory morphs into the Crusades. The Crusades is about expanding the empire as well as about protecting Jerusalem. In the 13th century, the church begins defining a new category of other. This is in the writings of the papal bulls, and the term infidels is introduced. This is a group of other that gets introduced in the writings of the papal bulls. Now, this is first used in reference to the Muslims, and later it's used in reference to indigenous peoples, or people who worshiped other gods. This is a fundamental change even to the just war theory, because now your wars are justifiable based on theological grounds. Now you can go to war because you're fighting the other. You're fighting the infidel. You're fighting for theological reasons. So this is the context that we enter into the 1400s. In the 1400s, we have the writings of the papal bulls with Pope Nicholas V, who says things like, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and their use and profit. Papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493 have collectively become known as what's called the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is these series of papal bulls. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by Christian rulers, those people are less than human, and the land's yours for the taking. It was this doctrine of discovery that allowed European nations to go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the African people. They weren't human. It was this same doctrine of discovery that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in a new world already inhabited by millions and claim to have discovered it. You cannot discover lands that's already inhabited. That's called stealing. If you don't believe me, put your cell phones, your tablets, and your car keys in front of you, and I'll come by and discover them for you. You can't discover lands already inhabited. That's stealing, conquering, colonizing. The fact that to this day we refer to what Columbus did as discovery reveals the implicit bias of America, which is natives are not fully human. The doctrine of discovery came out of this belief that there was a Christian empire. The doctrine of discovery is the fruit of an empire, of a church that has been prostituting itself out to the empire for 1,100 years. Now, initially, the Protestant church pushed back against the doctrine of discovery. This was a Catholic doctrine. They didn't fully buy into it. But in 1630, John Winthrop was in the Boston harbor. He was with a group of people who had come to plant the Boston colony. In this harbor, on this boat, he preached a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. At the beginning of his sermon, he compares the colonists to a city on a hill. He borrows from the image of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining your good deeds into this dark world. He goes on in his sermon to encourage them, to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality, to rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. These are not bad Christian exhortations. At the end of his sermon, he starts quoting Deuteronomy Chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy Chapter 30 is the point where the people of Israel are at the banks of the Jordan River, and Moses is reiterating the threats and promises of God's covenant with them, his land covenant with the people of Israel. If you obey me, I'll do this for you. If you disobey me, I'll do this to you. At the end of that passage, it says, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop says vast sea. Why does John Winthrop say vast sea? Well, because they didn't cross a river. They crossed an ocean. So what is he implying to the boatload of people he's with? That based on the exhortations of Jesus to be a city on a hill, And based on the model of Old Testament Israel, they are standing at the banks of their promised land, about ready to go and take possession of it. Now, who's read the book of Joshua? What's God's command to the people of Israel in Joshua? Kill everybody. What's Israel's sin in the book of Joshua? They didn't kill everybody. Promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. This idea percolates for about 100 years. Middle of the 1700s, the nation begins expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains, we go past the Mississippi River, we go further and further west. As we go further west, the Second Great Awakening begins happening. There's this renewal of denominations. There's this religious fervor as settlers are moving further and further west across the continent. And by the end of, or the beginning of the 1800s, the term manifest destiny is born. This belief that this nation had the God-ordained right to rule this continent from sea to shining sea. Promised lands and manifest destiny are how a Christian nation, a Christian empire, justifies its history of oppression and injustice. In 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he said to the colonists, "You no longer have the right of discovery of all the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia." This upset the colonists. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on in their letter to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, "All men are created equal," the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason they use the term all men is because they had a very narrow definition of who was and who was not human. This, of course, makes the Declaration of Independence a systemically racist document that assumes the dehumanization of people of color. A few years later, these colonists wrote another document. They began this document with the terms, "We the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union. This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, Article 1, Section 2 of this Constitution, just a few lines later, the section that defines who we the people actually refers to, it never mentions women, it specifically excludes natives, and it counts African slaves as 3/5 of a person. So clearly, we the people literally means white landowning men of the United States in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to white landowning men and white landowning men's posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. We don't tell ourselves this often, but the Constitution of the United States was literally written to protect the interests of white landowning men. That was the purpose of it. So today, women earn 70 cents to the dollar. We shouldn't be surprised. The Constitution's working. Our jails are filled with people of color. We should not be surprised. The Constitution's working. In 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and determined that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. We should not be surprised. The Constitution is doing what it was intended to do. It is protecting the interests of white landowning men. Now maybe you're thinking, wait, didn't we correct that? Well, about 100 years later, we passed the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment extended the right of citizenship to anyone born on this continent under the jurisdiction of the government. However, it did not give women the right to vote. Women didn't receive that right until 1920 with women's suffrage. It didn't give natives the right to vote. Even when we became citizens in 1924 through the Indian Citizenship Act, many of our tribes didn't get the right to vote until 1948, decades later. So while the 14th Amendment did extend some rights of citizenship to a few former male slaves, it still left disenfranchised huge segments of the society. And we forget that it was in 1973, the same amendment, the 14th Amendment, was used in Roe versus Wade, which now concluded unborn babies weren't human, and therefore they could be aborted. What this demonstrates is at the heart of the Constitution is not a value for life, but a practice of dehumanization with a value for exploitation and profit. This makes the Constitution a systemically racist document that assumes the dominant has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. In 1823, there was a Supreme Court case, Johnson versus Mcintosh. This is two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One guy got the land from a native tribe. The other guy got it from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The court had to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. They determined the principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subject or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. They went on to state that based on the doctrine of discovery, natives who were here first but were less than human only had the right of occupancy to land, like a fish occupies water or a bird occupies air, while Europeans had the right of discovery to the land and therefore the true title to it. This court case, along with a few others during the Marshall Court era, created the legal precedent for land titles. This precedent and the doctrine of discovery were referenced by the Supreme Court as recently as 2005. This, of course, makes the United States Supreme Court a systemically racist court that to this day has legal precedent based on the dehumanization of people of color. Dehumanizing and systemic racism are the fruits of a Christian empire that is in a constant state of war against the other. Now that we have a racist Declaration of Independence, a racist Constitution, and a racist Supreme Court, we have a bunch of history we've never talked about before. About a year ago, I was asked to write an article about the Doctrine of Discovery and our nation at war. So I did some research, and from 1775 to 2016, every year in blue here is the year that I found our nation was in a declared state of war or armed military conflict against another nation or entity. I then decided to put into red every year that our nation was at war against native peoples. There's a list of all the wars we fought against native peoples. You'll especially can notice in the 1800s, from 1811 to 1886, our nation was almost in a constant state of war against native peoples. This is the 19th century. This is the century we refer to as our century of expansion. This is the century that we added 30 states to the Union. But this wasn't a century of expansion. This was literally a century of ethnic cleansing and genocide. In the 1830s, we had the Indian Removal Act. This was an act of Congress that gave the military, in practice, the ability by force to remove nations from their lands in the east to more empty lands further in the west. This is what resulted in the Trail of Tears for the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Cherokee people. Other forced removals happened around the country. All told, about a dozen or so tribes experienced forced removals, and tens of thousands of people died as a result of this act. In 1862, we had the largest mass execution in the history of our nation. After about a month of military skirmishes over some land in Minnesota, because the treaty had been signed with the tribe there, and the government was not fulfilling their treaty obligations, and winter was coming on, and so the tribe knew they were going to die, so they had some military skirmishes or fighting with the settlers and the tribes of the area. After about a month, about 500 of the soldiers surrendered, and another 500 or so fled north, and they were tried in military tribunals, and at the end of those trials, it was determined that 400 and so of them were sentenced to die. Now, this was military trials, so their deaths had to be ordered by the president. So Abraham Lincoln, who was our president at that time, he felt that 400 and so deaths were a little too genocidal for his taste. So he didn't order retrials, even though the trials were a sham. They lasted a minute for each of the warriors. They were just kind of ran through those like cattle. He didn't order a retrial. He just changed the criteria of what constituted a death warrant. By his new criteria, only 2 were going to die. Well, that didn't seem harsh enough. So again, he changed the criteria a third time. And at the end of the day, 38 warriors were sentenced to die. So the day after Christmas, 1862, we had the largest mass execution in the history of our country, ordered by President Abraham Lincoln. In 1864, there was a band of Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children encamped over a hillside in Colorado. And the U.S. Army came over this hillside. The natives were flying a white flag of surrender and an American flag to show they were there peacefully. This army that was led by a Methodist pastor ordered them all slaughtered. And they were about 150 to 200 were killed that day. There are reports later that their genitalia were paraded down the streets of Denver. In 1879, we had the start of Indian boarding schools. The first one opened in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's called the Carlisle Indian School. The stated goal of these schools was to kill the Indian to save the man. Native children were taken from their homes and from their communities. They were raised in these military-style boarding schools. Abuse, sexual, verbal, physical, mental, abounded at these places. They were punished for speaking their languages. They were punished for practicing their culture. And many of the churches throughout the country ran schools in conjunction with the government. The last of these schools didn't close until the 1980s. In 1890, we had one of the more famous massacres in our nation. It's the Massacre at Wounded Knee. This is about 350, 400 natives were slaughtered in a single day at Wounded Knee. This is a little more famous battle, but what we don't know about this, or we don't talk about, is that the U.S. Army gave out 20 Congressional Medals of Honor to the soldiers who participated in this massacre. Promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. Before we go on any further, I want to just take a moment because I know I've just dumped a ton of history on you. And I know there's a lot of different emotions going on inside. So I want to take just a few moments. And let's just sit here and I want you to share, first of all, just with one another. Just 1 or 2 words, maybe 3 words at the most. Not a story, not anything, but just what emotions are going through you right now. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no good or bad answer. Just what emotions are going through you right now. Just turn to your neighbor, turn to someone around you, and just 1 or 2 words. Okay, let's come back together. Let's take a few moments, not a long time, but just a few people, just say a few of the emotions that are going through you. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, no good or bad answer. Just what are you feeling right now? What's going through your heart, your mind? Yes. Betrayal. Shocked? Disillusioned? Curious? Saddened? Privileged? Unsurprised? Yeah. I've found over the years or over the months, it's good to kind of have just a little bit of release. Who learns something new in that little, yeah. This is not a history we talk about. This is not something that we discuss in our classes or in our history books or in our churches. So, again, this all started because of this belief there was such a thing as a Christian empire. That's what led to the writing of this Doctrine of Discovery. So the question we have to ask is, how does a Christian empire respond to this sort of history? What does a Christian empire do? Well, perhaps the Christian empire could apologize. So on December 19, 2009, Congress signed House Resolution 3326. This was a 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Act. It's a 67-page document laying out the appropriations for the DoD for 2010. Page 45, subsection 8113 is titled, Apology to Native Peoples of the United States. What follows is this 7-bullet point apology. It mentions no specific tribe, no specific treaty, and no specific injustice. It basically says you had some nice land. Our citizens didn't take it very politely, but now let's just call it all of our land and steward it together. And it ends with a disclaimer stating nothing in here is legally binding. To date, this apology has not been announced, read, or publicized by the White House or by Congress. So maybe apology isn't going to work. So maybe a Christian empire can ask a priest to absolve its sins. So last year, a little over a year ago, Pope Francis was here in the United States. There was a lot of excitement about this because he actually is a very prophetic guy. He's not afraid to speak truth, and he goes into a lot of situations. I mean, he's driving around the United States in a Fiat as he thumbs his nose at big oil. And so there's this expectation, what's he going to say? What's going to happen here? And just a few months earlier when he was in Bolivia, he actually used language of apology to the indigenous people of Bolivia. So there was some excitement of what's he going to say here? What's he going to do about some of the historical injustices of our nation? And so during his speech to a joint session of our Congress, which was in about the middle third of his speech, he actually addressed the violence and he addressed the injustices of our nation against indigenous peoples. But he ended that section by stating, but it's difficult to judge the past by the criteria of the present. What does that mean? He told our Congress it's okay. We're not going to hold it against you. On top of that, the day before, he canonized Junipero Serra, who helped establish the mission schools and the missions in the Pacific Coast. I characterize that to canonizing someone from the KKK because of what those missions did to the native tribes and the native peoples in California. So, even a hugely prophetic priest isn't going to have the courage to address the sins of the nation to this nation. So maybe the country can fix itself. Maybe the Christian empire can pull itself up by its bootstraps and fix itself. Well, a few months ago, I was in Georgia. I was in Atlanta, and I was speaking at a conference in an inner city church in Atlanta, and I was the last speaker of the conference, and I was speaking about the Doctrine of Discovery. So the afternoon before I spoke, it was a Saturday afternoon, we actually took a tour of the neighborhood. We were in an impoverished inner city neighborhood downtown Atlanta, and we went to this old school that had been abandoned. It was burned down and it had been abandoned, and because this school was burned down, the students were now being bused all over the city. And they asked us to pray that God would bring education back into this neighborhood. Then we also went to a community center that was being rebuilt. And we prayed, they asked us to pray that God would bring more role models and more community-based services back into this neighborhood and begin to develop the community once again. A third place we went to was an abandoned house. Now, half of the houses in this neighborhood were abandoned. They were sitting empty. Of the half that were occupied, most of those houses were rental units. There were very few owner-occupied houses in that neighborhood. And so they asked us to pray that God would allow more people in that neighborhood to buy a home, so we could have owner-occupied houses, because that's how you do community development. We then went back to the church, and I took the stage, and I talked about the Doctrine of Discovery. And I laid out the legal precedent for land titles based on the dehumanization of Native peoples. And I said to the audience, who was mostly African American, but it was some diversity in there. And I said, so I want you to think about what we just did, which is we literally just prayed that God would allow more of the people in this neighborhood to participate in this dehumanizing system by buying and selling land that was stolen from natives, and justified it by dehumanizing them. I said, what do you think of that? And they said, well, it's hard for us to get loans. It's hard for us to become homeowners in this country. I said, no, that's not the question. I said, we just prayed that God would intervene and would help more people from this neighborhood to participate in perpetuating this dehumanizing system. So what do you think of that? And people just looked at me. And I said, we don't know what justice looks like when everything in our possession is stolen property. We tend to think justice is just about a redistribution of the resources. We don't know what to do when the entire system's corrupt, when the entire thing is based on the dehumanization of a group of people. That makes the question way too complex, way too difficult. So maybe the empire can't just fix itself. So perhaps an empire can lament. Can a Christian empire lament? Well, if I were to call the American church to lament the sin of racism, to lament the sin of slavery, to lament the sin of stolen lands, broken treaties, internment camps, boarding schools, ethnic cleansing, if you're really going to lament, if you're really going to sit in that uncomfortable place, you have to have some light at the end of the tunnel, something that says it's going to get better. So if I were to call the American church to lament, most of the church would look for its comfort in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14. This is the verse that says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sins and what? Heal their land. We forget that as Americans, even as American Christians, we are not God's chosen people, and this isn't your promised land. The United States of America does not have a land covenant with the God of Israel. The United States of America is not rich and powerful because of God's blessing. We're rich and powerful because we're systemically racist and inherently unjust. The American dream is predicated upon two things: an empty continent and free labor. That's what the American dream is based on. But we don't really believe that, do we? Well, a year and a half ago, March 3rd, 2015, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, was here lobbying our Congress against the Iran nuclear deal that was being negotiated. And he spoke to a joint session of the United States Congress. Now, he was speaking to a very divided, a very partisan group of people, a group of people who have almost very little of anything in common. And he had to find the common thread that would bring all these people behind him in support or in opposition to this nuclear deal. So towards the beginning of his speech, he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny. The destiny of promised lands. Now, do you really think the Prime Minister of Israel believes you and I share in the sacred covenant his people have with the God of Abraham? Or is he merely a very savvy politician who knows and understands deeply the implicit bias of his audience? And knows what they want to hear, knows what they need to hear. So a Christian empire can't even lament. So maybe instead of asking what the Christian empire should do, we should ask ourselves, what should the bride of Christ do? Remember, there's no such thing biblically as a Christian empire. And even if there was, the United States of America would not be it. The United States of America never has been, is not currently, nor will it ever be Christian. There's no such thing as a Christian empire. You can have an empire with Christians in it, but you cannot have a Christian empire. That doesn't exist. That was not Jesus' goal. He had 3 chances to set one up, and each time he declined. He didn't come to make an empire. He came to plant a church. The bride of Christ, the church. How should the church respond to something like this? Well, the first thing the church needs to do is get out of bed with the empire. We have to get out of bed with the entity that we've been prostituting ourselves out to for 1,100 years. How many churches are reluctant, if not adamant, not to engage in political dialogue merely because they don't want to risk their 501c3 tax-exempt status? How often has the church remained silent when it should be speaking prophetically because we didn't want to lose our tax-exempt status? We have to get out of bed with the empire. The church is strongest when it is a separate, independent entity from the world around it. Not that it doesn't interact with it, not that it's not around it, but we cannot have the same institutional structures. Remember, we are the bride of Christ, and we have a very, very, very jealous husband. While the empire, the Christian empire, can't lament, the church can. The church can acknowledge its sin. The church can be in a place of recognizing what's happened and what it's been a part of. The church can lament. Now, one of the challenges with lament for the church is in the American church, we're so unaccustomed to lament, we're so uncomfortable with lament that we don't stay in it very long. If you read the books of the Bible, if you read the scriptures, you will see that God meets his people in lament. The problem is our church doesn't stay there long enough for God to show up. We're just there for an instant, then we're out of that place. We have to learn how to sit there, how to be, just sit in that place and allow God to come and lead us out of that. So if we're really going to sit there, we have to find a hope. What is the hope of the church? What is the hope of God's people? Well, we have to understand that we are citizens of an empire that's not Christian. The hope of this empire does not come from a covenant with God. The hope of the empire that we're citizens of here on this earth, our hope comes from the way God interacted with non-Jewish people, how he interacted with the other pagan nations of the Old Testament scriptures. The hope of the United States of America comes from the fact that God was actually willing to negotiate with Abraham over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. The hope of America comes from the fact that God pulled Rahab out of Jericho before he destroyed the city. The hope of the empire that we live in comes from the fact that God, of his own desire, said to Jonah, I want to have mercy on Nineveh, go and prophesy to them. The hope of our nation does not come from a covenant with God, it comes from the character of God. I love the way C.S. Lewis put this in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Remember this book? The kids have gone to Narnia. It's always winter, never Christmas, never spring. They've lost their brother to the White Witch. They're walking through this land. They meet the beavers. They're hearing about this character, Aslan, and they go to the beavers and they're asking questions about who this Aslan who is on the move might be. And as they're dialoguing with the beavers, finally Susan says, excuse me, but is Aslan a man? And Mrs. Beaver starts laughing. No, honey, he's not a man. He's a lion. Oh my gosh. I should feel quite nervous about meeting a lion. Well, you should, they say. If anyone can stand for Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just plain silly. And then the kids ask, well, is he safe? No, he's not. He's a lion. But he's good. He's good. Confessing the sins of our nation, confessing the sins of the church will not be safe. But our hope is that God is good. If as a child, any of you stole a bike and you went to your parents and said, Mom, Dad, I stole this bike. I feel really bad about it. Which of your parents let you keep the bike? Confessing the sins of our nation will not be safe. But our hope comes from the fact that God is good. The challenge that we feel right now is we tend to justify ourselves based on our citizenship in this Christian empire. God is not going to look at your passport when you die. He's not going to check your driver's license. He's not even going to look at your GPA or your report cards. Don't let your professors know that. He's not. It doesn't matter. There are going to be people in heaven from North Korea, from Iran, from Iraq, from China, as well as from America. God is not going to check. Your passport has no bearing at all. You are covered by one thing and one thing alone, and that's the blood of Christ. Your sins are not justified because you have promised lands. The history of this nation is not justified because this nation has a self-proclaimed manifest destiny. One of the biggest challenges of America is we've never lost a war that matters. After World War II, Germany began teaching its citizens the Holocaust. Why? So they could do it better the next time? No, so they would never do it again. After World War II, Japan Quit having a military. What did we do after we killed tens of thousands of civilians by dropping bombs on Japan? What did we do? We ramped up our nuclear arsenal. What did we do after we ethnically cleansed this land of native peoples? We've never lost a war that mattered. We've never had to look back and have the shame and the guilt and the shame of the globe upon us and look back at our history and say, we probably shouldn't have done that. And that has been to America's detriment. Because of that, we've never had to look back on our history and not only try to change a way to move forward, but look back in mourning and sorrow and grief and lament and say, we should not have done that. What can we do to make sure we never do that again? One of the biggest challenges we have as Americans is that we live in a nation that desperately, desperately wants to be the moral leaders, the moral compass of the world. We want more than almost anything to be the moral compasses of the world. We want to be the good guys. The problem is we don't want to put the fruits of our injustice on the table. And you can't have it both ways. You cannot be the moral leaders of the world and not put the fruits of your injustice on the table. There are many, many nations around the world that say to their minorities and to their people, yeah, you're right, we beat the crap out of you. Live with it, deal with it. We're an oppressive regime. Get over it. The United States can say that. It's not a Christian nation. It can say that. But it's going to lose its moral authority. It's going to lose the moral compass. We cannot be the moral compass without putting the fruits of our injustice on the table. And the challenge we're facing today is we've tried to avoid that with all costs. At all costs, we've tried to avoid that. That's why we use language of discovery. That's why we talk about the 19th century as a century of expansion. That's why we use the terms manifest destiny. Because we don't know how to have moral authority if we're a nation built on ethnic cleansing and genocide. I truly, truly believe America will actually be a better nation if it has a prophetic, independent church inside that nation that can speak truth to it. It's not going to be a better nation if it's in bed with a Christian prostitute. That doesn't help anybody. Many nations have had what are called truth and reconciliation commissions, national dialogues about their history, about their past. South Africa had one after the fall of apartheid. Rwanda had one after a bloody civil war. Canada just had one after a very expensive lawsuit brought by boarding school survivors. National dialogues on race. National dialogues on historic injustice and oppression, trying to find some way to move the conversation forward, trying to teach the nation how to talk about its own history and find a way to move forward. I'm convinced our nation needs something like that, but I no longer use the term racial reconciliation. If you understand our nation's history and you understand race, racial reconciliation is a misnomer. First of all, race is a human construct. It's not genetic. There's no genetic difference between the races. Race is a human construct. And in America, race was created for the purpose of oppressing and dividing, For the black race, we had what was called the one drop rule. Do you know what this rule is? If you have one drop of African blood in you, you're black, and you can be a slave. Why do we have this rule? Blacks were our labor pool. We wanted as many of them as possible. The one drop rule allowed a white slave owner to rape one of his female slaves and create baby slaves. For natives, we have what was called the blood quantum rule. You're full, half, quarter, eighth, 16th, 32nd, then you're bred out of existence. Why? The myth of America is this continent was empty. We want as few natives as possible. So the Indian race, the American Indian race, was constructed to breed us out of existence. Race in the United States of America was constructed for the purpose of oppressing and dividing. Reconciliation implies a previous harmony in the relationship. If you understand the Doctrine of Discovery, you understand racial history in America, that harmony never existed here. The term racial reconciliation is a misnomer. All it does is allow us to perpetuate the myth of America. Things were once good here. We used to be Christian. This used to be a great place. That's all a myth. I've started using the term racial conciliation. Conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute. Reconciliation lets us perpetuate the myth. Conciliation requires a much more honest starting point in the conversation. So while many nations have had what are called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, I'm advocating we need a Truth and Conciliation Commission. A way to talk about our history, deal with it for what it is, and find a way to move forward. There's an Aboriginal leader named George Erasmus out of Canada who says where common memory is lacking, where people don't share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must first be created. I think this quote gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race. We do not have a common memory. We have a dominant culture that remembers a history of discovery, expansion, opportunity, and exceptionalism. And we have minority communities that have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, ethnic cleansing, genocide, Jim Crow laws, segregation, boarding schools, internment camps. And there's no common memory. It makes it very difficult for us to find a way to move forward. I think the church needs to be a part of creating this common memory. I think we can actually lead the way into this dialogue, into this conversation. The church can become healthier, and the nation can actually become healthier as well. But to go into that process, the people of God, the bride of Christ, we have to get out of bed with the empire, and we have to go into what I'm calling a season of lament. A period of just allowing God to bring us deeper into understanding what's happened, understanding the past. I like the word season of lament because who changes the seasons? It's God. It's not a service of lament. It's not a period of lament. It's a season of lament. We need to sit in this place for a while and allow God to meet us there. And then allow God to move us forward and bring us to a better place. So that's the challenge I want to leave with you tonight. We are in a very, very difficult place as a nation, and we're in a very difficult place as a church. I know God is not disinvolved in this. I know He wants to do something. And I think the best way we're going to hear from God is to go into a season of lament. Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you tonight.